Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my hidden gems for Week 1 of the 2019 fantasy football season. Now, for many of us, our rosters are already set for the exciting weekend ahead with unknown possibilities that await us. Unfortunately, the snap that occurred last season has forced many fantasy football team owners to forget about the valuable prospects that sit amongst the waiver wire. The only way to reclaim our fantasy studs is to use the fantasy realm in order to gather the hidden gems and bring back our championship lineups. This time, we're going after players that are owned in less than 50% of leagues. They're scattered across time, and the only way to get them is with the Fantasy Gauntlet, and I'm going to be sharing that with you today. We know where they play, we know they all have immense skill, and we know our mission, whatever it takes. Hey everybody, how's it going? All right, so we're talking about hidden gems. Yes, the series is back, and let's be honest, okay? We all know that we all want to see the Fantasy Gauntlet. Here it is. Okay, so I've got the Fantasy Gauntlet right in my hands. The whole thing is, I'm not going to use it yet. We're going to be patient. At the end of the video, after I'm done talking about these 6 hidden gems for this week for the fantasy football season, we'll use the Fantasy Gauntlet responsibly. Okay, for now, we're going to put it down. We're gonna leave it aside, and we're gonna talk about some fantasy prospects that I believe are hidden gems, not only for Week 1 but going forward. Now, I know many of you who are familiar with the channel, who have seen these videos, are used to fantasy prospects that I am suggesting for that said week. The fact of the matter is, last season, many of the prospects that I suggested in hidden gems, sure, performed on that week, but also had longevity throughout the season. So when I talk about these 6 players today, I don't want you guys to come to conclusions and say, okay, Andrew suggested this player, I'm going to go ahead, grab him off the waiver wire, and throw him into my lineup in Week 1. That's not what I'm suggesting. I'm suggesting maybe give these players a second look. Make sure that these players are on your rosters going through the rest of the season before Monday or Wednesday waiver wires begins. Because let's be honest, after the first week of the season, it becomes a shit show. People begin to panic, especially those who lost in Week 1. It becomes just a complete rotation of everyone wants to trade out their bench, grab new players who performed well, and I'm giving you these names in order to make sure that they're on your rosters before the weekend even happens so that you can be ahead of the curve come this week, okay? So let's talk about my guys this week, my hidden gems. Number 1, John Brown of the Buffalo Bills. Now, he is going to be the Mind Stone this week. John Brown is only owned in 49% of Yahoo fantasy leagues thus far this season. Now, I do use Yahoo primarily, so that's where I got my statistics from in terms of ownership. The thing is, he's the highest owned player on today's list, and I wanted to talk about him first and why he's my Mind Stone, because looking at the matchup that he has ahead of him, sure, he may be playing for the Buffalo Bills, and at times I have also mentioned that I don't want wide receivers associated with not so great offenses, but I really do believe John Brown has a great opportunity this week to catch himself a couple, couple slants, couple deep routes to make himself a relevant wide receiver going forward and potentially the number 1 wide receiver for the Buffalo Bills in 2019. So let's talk about a couple of the stats that kind of intrigued me with John Brown this week. So having, Josh Allen at the quarterback position, that might be a little tricky, but when you play against the Jets, you should expect to throw the ball heavily. Last season, the New York Jets gave up the second most points to the wide receiver position, giving up nearly 36.18 fantasy points per game in half-point PPR scoring formats. Now, that was literally only 0.06 points away from being the worst team next to the Saints in giving up points to the wide receiver position. So we know the Jets secondary, they're not great against the pass. And they really haven't done much this offseason to address that in order to stop wide receivers from torching them on a weekly basis. Now, what are we familiar with John Brown from? Last season, he played with the Baltimore Ravens. During the offseason, he was signed to the Bills. But in his little tenure with the Ravens, it was pretty short, to be honest, short-lived. He was a good deep ball receiver. Last season, he averaged 17 yards per reception average, which is pretty ridiculous considering his usage. I mean, really, He had less than a 50% catch rate, or it was close to. He had like 97 receptions, 97 targets, 42 receptions, and it wasn't looking too good for John Brown. But there are some things that we can take away from his experiences in Baltimore to give us a little bit more confidence in John Brown going into 2019. Number one has to do with his weeks 1 through 7 performances of last season. Now, as we all know, Lamar Jackson is the current starting quarterback of the Baltimore Ravens, but that was not the entire case of last season. Joe Flacco with John Brown from weeks 1 through 7 were a great combination. In fact, John Brown was the number 14 wide receiver from weeks 1 through 7 of last season in half-point PPR scoring formats. As soon as Joe Flacco got injured, hit the bye week, and Lamar Jackson took over, John Brown, he went to dust. The snap came in, dusted him away. But here's the thing. Going into 2019, we've seen Josh Allen use deep ball receivers pretty effectively. Sure, his deep ball accuracy has not been great, but with the way that Josh Allen used Robert Foster at the end of the 2018 season, it gives me confidence that a guy like John Brown coming into this organization, becoming the number 1 wide receiver, has a possibility to be a pretty decent wide receiver 3 at times into great matchups as such. So speaking of that, Josh Allen and Robert Foster, their connection in the last 7 weeks of the regular season in 2018 forced Robert Foster to be the number 23 wide receiver in that span of time. That's correct. From weeks 10 to 17, Robert Foster was the number 23 wide receiver in half PPR, and that was in only 7 games. So we've seen Josh Allen be able to hook up with the receiver in the deep ball game. We've seen him be able to at least contribute and make wide receivers relevant like Robert Foster was last season at the end of the season, like many of you know or remember from the waiver wire videos. John Brown, as of right now, as my Mindstone, just thinking about it, cursed with knowledge, I really do believe going forward throughout the season, whether it's week 1 or moving forward, John Brown needs to be rostered in your league, and he's a guy that could potentially be the number 1 wide receiver and a pretty good contributing factor to this offense. Let's not forget, John Brown has been a 1,000-yard receiving kind of guy in the past with Arizona a couple years back. Yes, he's dealt with injuries as of late, but I'm pretty sure we can get past that. And if we can avoid injuries, John Brown could be a pretty good hidden gem, and that's why he's my Mindstone for week 1. Let's go ahead and move on. Let's talk about some other players. Number 2 on today's list, we're talking about the Power Stone. We're going over to Morag. If you understand that reference, bless you. Here's the thing. We're talking about Danny Amendola. Now, I understand. You may be thinking, really? Danny Amendola is a hidden gem? He's only owned in 5% of Yahoo Fantasy Leagues as of right now, which is really low considering kind of what I'm about to explain to you. So last season, Danny Amendola spent 15 games with the Miami Dolphins, in which he finished as the number 61 wide receiver in half PPR scoring formats. Now, that's nothing to be excited about or go home about and rah-rah for Danny Amendola, but the Lions organization presents Danny Amendola a position within the offense that I believe he can thrive in because of the usage of the slot position and how much Matthew Stafford has utilized that position in the last couple seasons. Now, let me explain. Last season, Danny Amendola, sure, with the Miami Dolphins wasn't great. The quarterback carousel there wasn't, servicing him very well. But when he was given an ample amount of targets from weeks 6 through 10, in those 4 weeks, he was the number 17 wide receiver in fantasy football with 41 targets in those 5 games. 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. That's a pretty decent amount of targets. He had 31 receptions, 305 yards, and 2 touchdowns in that time span, which was pretty good for him fantasy-wise. That was probably the most relevant he was last season. Now, when you come into the Lions offense, sure, you have to compete with Kenny Golladay, Marvin Jones, TJ Hawkinson, who was the first-round pick, Kerryon Johnson, but we have to remember that Golden Tate, for the last couple years, for the Detroit Lions, was a heavy contributor from the slot position, a guy that was averaging 125 targets a year, getting up there in the 90s to 100 catches, always getting near 900, 1,000 yards, and a handful of touchdowns. Golden Tate, sure, is a more talented wide receiver than Danny Amendola, but the fact of the matter is, when we're talking about who is going to fill into that slot position, it's Danny Amendola. He's going to be that slot receiver. Even when Golden Tate left the organization, was traded to the Eagles last season, Bruce Ellington moved into that slot position, and not even kidding, in 4 weeks, as soon as Golden Tate was gone, I think it was weeks 10 through 13, Bruce Ellington had 30 targets in those 4 weeks at the slot position. I'm telling you guys, there is value in the slot receiver for the Detroit Lions. I understand many people are thinking this Lions team wants to go towards a run-heavy offense. I'll believe it when I see it, but the Lions haven't been a run-heavy offense in quite some time, more like never, okay? So even with, yes, Matt Patricia coming in and trying to create this Patriots-esque offense, you're bringing in Danny Amendola for a reason. He is going to be a contributor in the slot. And I think as of right now, in a pretty decent matchup against the Arizona Cardinals this week that are struggling at the corner position, Danny Amendola may be a guy that the defense forgets about at times and can go ahead and force a couple plays and be a decent contributor in fantasy, especially in PPR formats, which you'll get a lot of targets and receptions. And let's not forget, besides Golden Tate and Bruce Ellington last season being contributors in the slot position, there's no more Theo Riddick. Sure, Kerryon Johnson is a 3-down back capable of receiving, but Theo Riddick was even used at the slot position. Anybody who is at the slot position for the Lions has value, and especially when Matthew Stafford's trying to get the ball out of his hands quickly against decent pass rush, I think Danny Amendola has a potential for the rest of the year to be a good contributor. I'm not saying you have to start in week 1, but I'm just saying keep your eyes on a guy that is very little owned in fantasy leagues and quite honestly forgotten at times. So this week, Danny Amendola, you are my power stone for the week and my hidden gem. Let's go ahead and move on. Let's talk about my next hidden gem on the week, the reality stone. We got to go to Asgard to grab this one, shall we? Justin Jackson. Now, when I mentioned Justin Jackson, when I was doing a little bit of the research on him, it's kind of ridiculous that he's only owned in 41% of Yahoo fantasy leagues thus far. Let's talk about it, right? The reality of the situation, right? As we talk about the reality stone, the reality of the situation is that Melvin Gordon's on a holdout, and chances are he's not coming back to play for the Chargers. The Chargers have already stated that they are not going to continue talks via extending his contract or giving him a new offer until the end of this season. So they've given his agent pretty much permission to go out and look for a trade. We heard rumors about the Eagles this week. We've heard rumors, fluttering around here and there. But as of right now, Austin Eckler and Justin Jackson are the 1-2 combo for the Chargers. And what we've seen in the last couple seasons, especially since Austin Eckler came into the Chargers organization, is that this backfield isn't a one-man job. Melvin Gordon and Austin Eckler, they have split snaps at times, and given Austin Eckler even enough value to even last season be an RB2 in half-point PPR scoring formats. So now that Justin Jackson is the backup to Austin Eckler, a little smaller stature guy that sure is more of a receiving back, Justin Jackson has a great opportunity, especially going forward and into better matchups, to be a relevant fantasy prospect in terms of what he can produce. Let's not forget, when Melvin Gordon was injured last season, Justin Jackson was given an opportunity to play for this organization from weeks 12 through 15. In those 4 weeks, Justin Jackson was the number 23 running back in fantasy football. Imagine that. A guy that just steps in as a rookie and ends up being a great contributor in that 4-week span. Sure, there was times in which Austin Eckler was injured, but hey, in only one of those games, of those 4 games, in only one of them did Justin Jackson start. Okay, so let's just put that in perspective. Now, in the games in which Austin Eckler and Justin Jackson split the backfield last season, it was a 70-30 split in terms of snaps. This offseason, during the preseason, what we've seen is more of a 60-40, and that's exactly what the organization has come out and said. We are looking to probably split the snaps 60-40 between the two of them in order to give them both fresh legs and be able to rotate and use them effectively. Even last season in the 2 games that they played together, Austin Eckler ran the ball 28 times to Justin Jackson's 15 rushing attempts. To be honest, I think that will probably lean more towards Justin Jackson, as he's probably the better back in order to run between the tackles comparatively, because Austin Eckler, yes, he's a smaller stature guy. There's always a possibility, like last season, that he could get injured if they give him too many touches, and that's why Justin Jackson's so valuable with the reality stone this week. Anything other than that? Not really. I really think that if, in fact, you own Melvin Gordon, it might not be a bad idea to at least have Justin Jackson in case, because there is always a possibility that if Austin Eckler goes down with an injury, Justin Jackson's that starting running back. Sure, they might go sign somebody else, but Justin Jackson has the confidence of the organization. There's a reason why they're not offering Melvin Gordon the entire money or the bank, because they're pretty confident in Jackson and Eckler as a combination. So just bringing that to your guys' site. Just make sure, I'm telling you guys, 41% ownage is it's not a lot. It's not a lot. All right, moving on to my next running back of this week. We're talking about the time stone, and we're talking about Justice Hill. Now, Justice Hill is a guy that I've talked about many times this offseason because of how much the Baltimore Ravens love to run the ball. As soon as Lamar Jackson took over for the starting quarterback position of the Baltimore Ravens, the entire organization, the entire offense shifted. Okay, Lamar Jackson was able to lead the Ravens to the playoffs, and to be honest, that was mainly because of the rushing ability of this team. When Lamar Jackson took over in those 7 weeks of the regular season last season, the Baltimore Ravens ran the ball 230 yards per game on average. So now that we go into 2019, in week 1 presents us the Miami Dolphins defense that, let's be honest, the Miami Dolphins are in shambles. Besides the fact that last season they gave up the 5th most points to the running back position on a weekly basis, their organization is in the rebuilding process. They've traded away Laramie Tunsil. They traded away Kenny Stills. They got rid of Kiko Alonso. Sure, they even cut, I think, one of their better defensive tackles. Let me find this guy's name. It's on my screen somewhere here. All right. According to Pro Football Focus, in the PFF record era, the defensive tackle that they cut this past week, I think his last name was Taylor, yes, had the highest run stop percentage recorded by a rookie defensive tackle in the history of PFF recording statistics. They're getting rid of talent and this guy got signed by the Bills, by the way, a week after he got cut. They're getting rid of talent that it just doesn't make sense to me. I looked at their defensive depth chart. Sure, I like their secondary, but the Miami Dolphins, they're going to get the ball stuffed down their throat this week by a team that absolutely loves to run the ball. Whether it's by Lamar Jackson, whether it's by Mark Ingram, Gus Edwards, or Justice Hill, someone is going to plug the holes and absolutely just let the floodgates open against the Miami Dolphins down in Florida. Here's the thing. Gus Edwards and Justice Hill both are the number 3 and 4 back because, let's be honest, Lamar Jackson's RB1 on this team, and Mark Ingram is probably going to be the RB2. Now, after that, the organization, John Harbaugh, has come out and said, we're going to go with the hot hand. Whoever between Gus Edwards and Justice Hill ends up being the hot hand, that's who we're going to go with. Now, I 100% believe that this is going to be a blowout game. So what does that mean? Justice Hill and Gus Edwards are both going to be given an opportunity to run the ball multiple times in the second half, potentially in the fourth quarter, in order to earn that spot as the number 2 running back on the roster. I think this is the week for Justice Hill to come out. Besides the fact that he has been pretty good in preseason this offseason, I think this is the come-out game for him, the breakout game that potentially could get Justice Hill into the rotation as a guy that can be a 3-down back. We've seen him work in the passing game. He can run between the tackles, off tackle. It doesn't matter. He is a great all-around back, a guy that I'm very confident in. And this coming week, against a very easy matchup, I'm telling you, Justice Hill is a great guy to have on roster. Only owned in 32% of leagues thus far, which is atrocious. He needs to be rostered, guys, without a doubt in my mind. So make sure that you have him on roster before this weekend hits, before the Miami Dolphins get torched, and before Justice Hill is the number 1 waiver wire pickup of next week. Moving on to my next guy that I want to talk about today. Talking about the Miami Dolphins, let's talk about Albert Wilson. Yes, we've made it over here to Camp Lehigh to collect here the Power Stone. Here's the thing. Really quickly, before we move on to Albert Wilson, I want to mention Justice Hill. It's only a matter of time until he pretty much takes that job from Mark Ingram, or at least has a pretty big contributing factor in that backfield in terms of touches. So it's only a matter of time. But anyway, we're talking about Albert Wilson as this week's Space Stone. Now, the Space Stone, as we all know, for those of us who are MCU fans, the Space Stone is used to teleport. It has the ability to teleport. And Albert Wilson is one of those speedy receivers that practically teleports behind the secondary and finds himself open for deep bombs that gives him so much fantasy value. Now, Here's the thing about Albert Wilson. He's only owned in 9% of leagues thus far, and that's mainly because he's coming off a season-ending hip injury last season. And on top of that, your quarterback's Ryan Fitzpatrick, which isn't going to be a bad thing, but just wait. And let's be honest, he's a Dolphins wide receiver, and not too many people want ownership of such a player. So this is why I'm giving my argument for Albert Wilson this week as the Space Stone. Last season, when I was doing the research, looked at Pro Football Focus, and holy moly, they had some compelling stats that I kind of wanted to point out. Here they are. Thank you to Pro Football Focus. They are absolutely ridiculous. Last season, I mean, just looking at this, yards after the catch per reception, nobody was better than Albert Wilson. Oh, you want to go back to 2017? Nobody was. I mean, there was literally one person better than him in terms of all wide receivers or available prospects. And then just throughout his entire career, whether he's been with the Dolphins or with the Chiefs, the guy has been a monster yards after the reception, yards after the catch. Forced missed tackles per reception. Nobody's been better in the last 2 years than Albert Wilson. Sure, last season's depth of play only consists of those 7 weeks in which he was healthy. But in those 7 weeks, he was the number 21 wide receiver in fantasy in half-point PPR scoring formats. Just to put it in perspective, guys, Albert Wilson is a lot better than many people think. And what's even better is last season, he lined up at the slot position 71 times and had the 3rd highest slot grade amongst all wide receivers last season by Pro Football Focus, only behind DeAndre Hopkins and AJ Green. On top of that, you want an even spicier stat? Ryan Fitzpatrick in the last 10 years, nobody has targeted the slot position more than Ryan Fitzpatrick amongst all quarterbacks eligible. Yeah, that's right. Albert Wilson, sure, if he can stay healthy, can be a pretty good contributor. I'm not saying week 1 against the Ravens, he's popping off, right? Because that is a tough defense to play against. But I'm just telling you guys, keep in mind this is a hidden gem that in time could have or present some good value going into our fantasy football seasons. Just keep in mind, Albert Wilson, he's probably my favorite of the available wide receivers on the Dolphins going forward. So let's go ahead and let's move on to the last guy, the last hidden gem for this week. We're talking about Darren Waller. Why wouldn't we? I mean, why wouldn't we talk about Darren Waller this week? With all the Antonio Brown news, sure, Antonio Brown supposedly is going to be playing this week. He made his apology at practice, blah, blah. All right, well, that doesn't really bother me because the fact of the matter is the Oakland Raiders throw the ball heavily to the tight end position. Just go back to last season. When Jared Cook was the starting tight end of the Oakland Raiders, what exactly happened? Well, he was the number 1 receiving option of this team. Plain and simple. Ahead of everybody else. No Amari Cooper, no Jordy Nelson, no Jalen Richard. It was Jared Cook who led this team. He had 101 targets, 68 receptions, almost 900 receiving yards, 6 touchdowns. I mean, the amount of targets that Jared Cook, as the tight end of this team, absorbed. I mean, he had 18.16% of the passing attempts or the target share, excuse me. So this is what I'm saying. I'm not saying Darren Waller is better than Jared Cook, but I'm just explaining to you guys that there's a reason why Darren Waller is a sleeper in the industry right now. Derek Carr, sure, he's not the greatest quarterback. He has shown glimpses in the past of being a good quarterback. But Darren Waller is going to have to be his safety blanket because when they double cover Antonio Brown and they blitz and they stack the box and they make it hard for them to run the ball, and Tyrell Williams isn't doing much because all he does is run deep routes, Darren Waller is going to be the guy over the middle that's making a lot of plays. And I think going forward, he's a guy that needs to be owned, only owned in 33% of the fantasy leagues as of right now. He's the soul stone for a reason. Why? Because the soul stone, in order to get it, you need to sacrifice something. And I really think whoever it ends up being, whether we have to sacrifice Antonio Brown or Tyrell Williams or Jalen Richard out of this backfield or any of the receiving options out of that backfield, we're going to do it because I really do believe that Darren Waller is one of the next best young tight ends, a guy that is a wide receiver converted to the tight end position that is going to contribute heavily in this offense. We've seen how much Gruden loves using the tight end position, and it's only a matter of time until Darren Waller ends up proving everybody wrong and showing that he is a a force to be reckoned with in terms of fantasy football. So just keep that in mind. Those are my hidden gems of the week, guys. Plain and simple, these are guys that are not owned very heavily in fantasy football, and these are guys that potentially in the next coming weeks are going to be heavy waiver wire targets. And I want to go ahead, I want to bring that to your attention now so that when we sit here on Monday and we talk about waiver wire targets, we're aware, hey, these are the players that potentially we're going to have great weeks. And to be honest, we shouldn't be afraid of picking them up. I know many of you play in leagues in which you don't have a lot of bench spots, but these are players that I really like, and that's why they're here to create the fantasy gauntlet. All of these hidden gems have come together, and it's going to be great. I hope everybody enjoys this episode. If you did, click that like button. The Hidden Gem series is back. Every week we're going to be talking about 6 new players who I think has a potential for that week and going on to have great fantasy contributions, plain and simple, for their respective teams. So thank you everybody for watching. Thank you for supporting the channel. Thank you for supporting the Fantasy Gauntlet. Maybe I got to upgrade this thing. Maybe I got to get something other than this thing. Maybe I got to get the actual Gauntlet, but we'll see. Yes, it's an government. Don't worry about it. I know. Thanks everybody for watching, and until next time, I'll see you guys. Peace.